everyone. Thank you for joining this roundtable session today focused on multilateral innovation funding. My name is Sian Summerton and I'm based within the international team at the UK's Knowledge Transfer Network. It's so great to have you all with us here today. So we are hoping that today's session will be quite interactive. So we look forward to hearing all of your thoughts and questions. If you are joining us on YouTube, please do add your question into the chat box, which you will see next to the video, and we'll make sure that this is picked up. Finally, as noted in the registration link, please note that this is being recorded. Before we kick off with today's presentations, I'd just like to provide a bit of brief context and also acknowledge our funding partners, including the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, the Global Challenges Research Fund and Innovate UK. In country, we're working very closely with Shimbalogong Hub and TIA in South Africa, together with CC Hub in Nigeria and AfriLabs and iHub. So these are our key partners in the Global Alliance Africa project. So against the backdrop of COVID, at KTN, we have recently conducted a rapid analysis of the innovation response to COVID-19 in 23 countries around the world. And many of the challenges that surface through our rapid analysis can be traced back to structural gaps in the ecosystem that made it very difficult for actors to find partners, investors, facilities, data, and a whole myriad of other context-specific resources which were needed to facilitate the desired response. So as a result, we've put together this 3-week event series, of which we're now entering week 2. And the aim is to enhance innovative resilience in Africa through inclusive knowledge sharing, driving innovation through equitable partnerships, and ultimately looking at how we can build back stronger whilst working together. So our agenda today includes a series of presentations from the Global Innovation Fund, the Human Development Innovation Fund, and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. So thank you very much in advance to our speakers. We're very much looking forward to hearing your presentations. So following the presentations, we will have the opportunity to move into a roundtable discussion. So please do make note of any questions that you would like to ask our panelists at that point. In terms of the objectives of this particular session, we're hoping to address and highlight the role of and multilateral funding programs to fund African innovation in terms of meeting their immediate needs, creating the desired impacts, and also creating those opportunities for partnership. So on that note, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Lalit Kumar, who is the Managing Director for the Africa region at the Global Innovation Fund. In his role, he leads the Global Innovation Fund's presence in the region. He manages its portfolio and is constantly looking for excellent investment opportunities to drive evidence-driven innovations to scale. In his previous role, Lalit was part of a small team which founded Evidence Action, a non-profit organisation focused on large-scale expansion of evidence-based interventions. So Lalit, over to you. I will be driving your slides, so just direct me forward whenever you would like me to.
Great, thanks. And hello, everybody. So I'll just get straight to it, also cognizant of the fact that I think the meat of the conversation will be in the Q&A section, I guess. So on to the second slide, I just wanted to give a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. So I guess it'll be useful for everybody to have a small introduction about GIF, Global Innovation Fund, our COVID-19 response strategy, our experience so far of making investments in the space, and then key takeaways and questions that we honestly are still grappling with. So next slide, please. So I guess most of you probably would know already that Global Innovation Fund is a nonprofit innovation fund headquarters in London with an office in Washington, DC, and actually an office in Nairobi as well. We started just before COVID hit, and I went into the office for one day. The first case in Kenya was found on the 17th of March, and that was my first day into the office. So yeah. But we are very much in business. And GIF invests in development, in rigorous testing and scaling of innovations targeted at improving the lives of the world's poorest people. We do not have a focused geography or a sector because we believe that innovations can come from anywhere and can be impactful anywhere. But just based on how poverty is spread in the world, sub-Saharan Africa is where we have most of our investments. Over 60% of our investments are in sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of sectors, again, we are agnostic, but just to give you a sense of the breadth of our investments, we have investments in satellite technology, which helps smallholder farmers, to social franchising of ultra-poor graduation programs in the Philippines, to leveraging technology in refugee settings, and a whole host of other investments on the spectrum. We are, as I said earlier, we are an evidence-led, impact-driven organization, and historically, we have based our decisions on and have supported evidence generation through our grants and sometimes even through our risk capital investments. And finally, we work with a variety of investment tools, which is something unique to GIF. We make grant investments as well as context-appropriate risk capital instruments. I'm happy to talk to whoever wants to about GIF for whatever length, but for this conversation, I will focus on our COVID-19 work. So next slide, please. So one of the unique features of GIF is that we have the flexibility and ability to respond to a variety of needs in a short time span. And during COVID, we realized that was a big plus for us as an organization, because the kind of opportunities and the kind of needs were ill-defined because the pandemic hit a lot of us by surprise. And even if it took slightly longer to reach developing countries, I think when organizations or governments were trying to raise money, they didn't have very well-defined proposals to work with. So that was a huge positive for us. But still, we early on decided that this pandemic is something which would require a unified response. And it is something where we realize that it will be prudent to pool our resources and support collaborative initiatives which complement government efforts and fill the gaps left by government response, rather than try to support organizations which are trying to do good work, but broadly on their own. So that was a strategic choice that we had to make, because mostly we do support organizations which are small and which are trying to do work which is innovative, but not necessarily integrated into government systems, though that's what we would want. We also realized that it was important to err on side of effective and agile innovations and investment opportunities, which meant that we were not necessarily supporting cutting edge innovations, which is defined as like a lot of innovation is defined more narrowly as the new and the shiny, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think we have invested in a lot of those, but for this period, we decided that what we want to go for is something that has been tested and is likely to be effective rather than necessarily new. And during this period, we also have been quite flexible in our investment approach as well as in our processes. We have tailored our investment process to shorten the period of diligence. Normally, we would go to the field, which is not possible during this period. So we have found ways in which we can shorten the period that we spend diligencing to provide support to the recipient organizations at the earliest possible opportunity, so that they can actually go out to the field and do the work. Next slide, please. So I would just highlight a few organizations that we have supported and what we have learned in this process. So as I said in the previous slide, we decided to support a variety of organizations, some of which won't be super innovative or cutting edge necessarily. BRAC in Sierra Leone and in Uganda fits that category in the sense that BRAC has been around for a very long time. Now, the upside is that BRAC has the experience of being through the Ebola crisis in both those countries, and is one of the very few organizations which was working with the governments in that last two rounds of Ebola. So there is a wealth of knowledge that BRAC has, and that is what we are supporting BRAC with in those two countries, in addition to also leveraging technology to improve the health systems in both those countries. In contrast, Balloon Ventures is a very small and relatively young organization, 5 years entirely, it has a very novel business model where it lends between 5,000 to 10,000 US dollars annually to really small businesses, which otherwise can't access capital, and more importantly, managerial services and technical expertise, which is required to grow businesses. So Balloon offers this good mix of capital as well as extensive managerial support, which is extremely important and required during this period. So we have supported Balloon Ventures with a small grant last year, and are pleased that all the investments of Balloon have survived this period in Kenya and Uganda. And now Balloon is starting to make new investments. And what we have learned there is that the interconnectedness of sectors, I think a lot of, when we look at international development, a lot of times we think of investment opportunities as sectors of health and education, livelihoods, business. But what we are seeing through in Balloon is that something which primarily was a health pandemic, which I think is widely known and accepted now, but wasn't early on, actually has effect on education, and then education in turn has effect on business. So it is all interconnected. Then Health Connect is basically WhatsApp-based information provider, which works in South Africa and closely supports government's efforts in information dissemination, and is already doing quite a good work. And then finally, Strong Minds is an organization which works on mental health support to women in Uganda and Zambia. And again, in the pandemic, I think what has surfaced on the top is how much it is affecting the mental health of people working from home remotely, cloistered or not, and like what happens to people whose livelihoods are suddenly uncertain. So Strong Minds is doing quite a good work, and it has pivoted its business model quite strongly, where early on, till before COVID, it was relying on a peer group therapy model, and it has pivoted to a phone-based therapy model along with chatbots, and is collaborating with the government of Uganda and the government of Zambia in providing mental health support in these poor resource settings. So these are some of the examples of organizations which GIF is supporting. And next slide, please. So in terms of key takeaways and questions, I mean, there isn't anything path-breaking I'm going to say here. But yeah, what we have realized is that the status quo doesn't work. We need to evolve and change our processes and timelines when we are responding to something as grave as COVID. And we also grappled with and continue to grapple with this choice between tried and tested and the novel, and how to strike that balance. And we also realize that there is a need for trust when you're working in an environment and during a time when most likely we won't be able to meet people face to face and go out and do diligence in the field, which is quite an important part of being an investor. And then finally, we need to respond to the immediate with an eye to the future, because we are trying to do something in the present, but we also have to think about what this is doing to the economy and how we can support that. So yeah, these are some of our learnings. Happy to take questions during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lalit. That was really insightful. I think a lot of those key takeaways will really resonate with a lot of people. So I'm looking forward to hearing more in the roundtable Q&A discussion shortly. However, I would now like to move on to Marilyn Wilmink, who works for Palladium and supports the Human Development Innovation Fund as its project director and strategic advisor. She brings a wealth of experience of working in innovation and transition management, inclusive and circular business development, multi-stakeholder management, and strategic program development. She has institutional experience with international NGOs, the UN, various trusts and foundations, private sector, consultancy firms, and knowledge institutes. So thank you so much for joining us today, Marilyn.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to join this platform and to exchange experience. Yes, so let me immediately start off. You can move to the next slide. So HDF, as we call it, Human Development Innovation Fund, is already around for a while. We were launched in 2015. Are financed by FCDO, UK8, DFID, there are a lot of new names coming in, right? And we are primarily a challenge fund. So we were indeed financing innovators in Tanzania with the aim to really experiment, but also at the end commercialize, diffuse and scale innovations. We've been financing a lot of 43 in total innovative projects, primarily in the space of health, education and WASH, because that was very much aligned with the main program of BIFID FCDO in Tanzania. But we also realized throughout the last years that only supporting innovations, innovators is not enough, especially in an environment where innovation is not a given. So we were also investing in the innovation ecosystem, which is basically a concept word for everybody around an innovator that enables him or her to thrive. So from innovation hubs, accelerators, incubators, all kinds of service delivery agencies that make innovators reach to a certain scale. So that's what we call innovation ecosystem. And of course, what we also realized is that we need to work with those who can create a conducive environment. So, which is not only government, it's not only related to policy and regulatory environment, it's also media, you know, the creative vibe of innovation. It's also educational agencies that are kind of educating the youth to actually think out of the box. Failing is actually okay, you know, you can learn from it. So that mindset is crucial to create in order to have a full-fledged, let's say, innovation culture, innovation ecosystem. So we've been working at all these levels, starting from a challenge fund financing. We actually became more and more the kind of spider in the web, working with service delivery agencies, government, private sector, universities, and what you have. So yeah, you can go to the next slide. Just some examples of innovations that we've been supporting. I won't go into detail, but nanofilter is one of them, which was actually not an entrepreneur, it was a research lab. And that's also one of the things that I would like to highlight when I talk about lessons learned. We not only talk about entrepreneurs, we talk about researchers, we talk about out-of-the-box individuals that might not be an entrepreneur, but have an idea. So we talk about different people that require different support to actually enable them to put their idea in the market or to link it to either a development party or government or any agency that actually wants to use this innovation. So this is one of them, and we can go to the next slide. Another example is Ubongo, which is the African Sesame Street, basically. So they started as a company, then changed again to an NGO, well, let's say status, because it was quite difficult for them to receive actually donor money being a company. So they changed to an NGO. And what they basically do is provide edutainment. So it's a very interesting actor when it comes to COVID. Well, we'll go into that. So they basically are producing educational programs for children starting in Tanzania, but now they are Africa-wide. They are even featured on television in the US. So they've been starting very small, and now they're actually having 2 million children watching their TV programs. So yeah, that has been scaling a lot. Yeah, you can move to the next slide. And another example is hero rats. Everybody knows this one. So basically rats that can detect not only mines in Cambodia, but also TB in Tanzania. So again, that was, let's say, developed in a lab, but also for them in order to get recognition that actually this, well, it looks quite, you know, it's not very attractive if you look at a rat. So it was also changing the mindset of like this animal can actually support health clinics. but also to prove the case, to actually prove that this rat can actually detect TB, create recognition, create adoption, was most of the work. So it's not only the finance, again, it's the creation and the brokering of relations up till WTO actually, who also, WHO, sorry, who also need to recognize this type of innovation, right? Yeah, you can move to the next slide. So before I go into what COVID did to our program, I also want to already highlight some of the lessons learned that COVID only actually made more visible. So what we've been seeing in Tanzania, and I like these three circles to kind of give it a voice over, is that since donors have very much, let's say, acknowledged the impact of innovation on human development, also in Tanzania, you see the, let's say, the impact of technology or any innovation on human areas, talking about health, education, wash, kind of the public goods, has been quite big here. So there is a lot of relation building between an innovation that is, of course, first of all, working and functional, but then also to make that link between, sorry for the background, between innovation and a human need is a big movement that has been made here. So a lot of development partners have acknowledged the role of innovation, have also seen that innovation actually is positively impacting their program. That's the Tanzania picture. So the next step, and which is a much more difficult picture, is they're actually paying clients, right? So the viability of an innovation. And a paying client is not necessarily only commercial. It can also be government. It can also be development partners. It can be corporate sector. So yeah, I just give you this picture. If you see, let's say, the balancing act that we are now in, is on one hand, there's a big movement towards innovation having a development impact. But of course, if you want to create at the end a transformative innovation that is also scalable and that is also having different type of financial instruments, you need to look at two ways. And so you can go to the next slide just to give an example. So what we've seen, if you look at the kind of more the development route, yeah, you can move to the next slide. So the development route, and then if you press again, you see a bit the route. So for example, the RED, it's a research-based concept that had a huge impact on, let's say, the quality of a health solution, right? So this is very much a development impact track that might go into a more commercial track. It has not gone there. At the moment, we are actually scaling the innovation, having different clinics that are adopting the innovation, but we are not yet there that it's a fully accepted solution, let alone that there are also private investors interested in this, right? So if you go to the next slide, it's the other way around. So that's the more commercial track. So you can push again a few times. So this is not an example within our grantees, but if you work with, let's say, a post-harvesting method that is being adopted by a lot of companies, by a huge number of large farmers, you immediately have a commercial model. And it can live on its own, but it also has a huge development impact. If you, for example, say like, hey, let's add also a small scale model where smallholders can also make use of the innovation. So how accessible and inclusive is the innovation? That could be, let's say, another track that you add to this. So to play this balancing act, and you can go to the next slide, you need to work actually, and then you can push again, with different type of business models. So it's not like each innovator will be an entrepreneur and will scale to be a huge successful enterprise. It could also be a public-private partnership. It could also be a contracting arrangement between a government that wants to work with an innovator, as we saw in our water programs. So there are different ways to reach actually scalability, to reach adoption and anchoring of an innovation. That means that you need to have an audience, let's say potential consumers that understand the value of innovation. And therefore we invested a lot in kind of sharing the evidence, sharing the value of innovation, not only for social sectors, but also actually more and more for economic sectors, to actually create a transition. And if you push again, I'm not sure if I added more here. I'm not sure, I don't think so. So to create a transition actually between more opportunity-based, donor-driven innovations, and then slowly transition that into demand-based innovations, because that is the next step that we need to actually make here in Tanzania. And what we see also that there's a big need also of create actually development innovation sector actually, where you provide a platform, kind of a marketplace for innovators to not only relate to an investment community, but also relate to all of their potential clients, being development partners or government or corporate sector. And we see in order to reach that, we also need to have much more a kind of conveyor belt approach of, hey, this is the support that I give to this innovator, and what is the next level of support, looking at capacities and also looking at finance, which is not yet kind of structured here. We're working on that. So that is kind of a next level of process that we are looking into. And then, of course, at financial level, there are a lot of, as we like to call them, valley of death. So investors they won't go into a risky innovation scheme if they don't know what it brings. And their donors, development partners, multilateral donors, can play a huge role to bridge that gap, actually, from an innovation that is just starting up to a next level of innovations. And donors can take a lot of those risks. So, yeah, please, you can move on to the next slide. So then what did COVID-19 add to this? Because, it was a challenge, but it was also for the innovators in Tanzania, and you can move to the next slide, a huge opportunity, if I might call it like that, to position their solutions. And because what I mentioned in the beginning, the value of innovation and the demand side of innovation was all of a sudden there. All of a sudden it was right in their faces. So all the grantees that we have been supporting so far, and the 43 that I mentioned in the beginning, that were active in digital innovations, in education, edutainment, distant learning, e-systems for health, they were all so much in demand. It was like we didn't even have to pivot. It was like, hey, here you are. We have this basket of innovators that are actually doing wonderful things. So let's talk to those grantees that we've been actually financing. To here and there, of course, we needed to pivot. So we added some additional budgets to the grantees that we already had. But it was not like a large operation because they were there. They have been testing, prototyping, rolling out their innovation. And all of a sudden, everybody was looking at them. And so I think for Tanzania, for many innovators, it created an opportunity to say, like, actually, we are ready. We can use these innovations for direct response to the situation in which we are. So what we did, we talked to our grantees. Here and there, we tweaked and pivoted a bit their programs so that we could position them. So we gave them some additional financial and technical support. But what we also did primarily is using a lot of our time and efforts to create campaigns, media attention, and to actually bring on, let's say, the information about these wonderful examples that are already here in Tanzania. So that was the first phase when we were looking at direct response. Yeah, you can go to the next one. So the second phase, what we also did, well, it was not like second phase, it was a bit parallel, is that, of course, direct response, everybody was jumping on it, and it was, well, there was a lot of solutions floating around, but very soon we were asked by UNDP, by government of Tanzania, by corporate sectors, and also SMEs to look in the question, how can we actually use innovations to enhance the recovery and resilience of sectors that are very much affected? And in Tanzania, we looked at agri-food, logistics, and tourism, and specifically tourism was very bad and is still very, very seriously affected. I mean, overnight it was 0 tourists, 0 income. So what we did, we moderated, since these are not really our key sectors, but we are quite well aware of what's going on in the whole ecosystem. So we moderated a number of sessions where we brought in innovators and in co-creation kind of sessions where they would bring on their solution and negotiate, discuss, debate with the other sectors how their solutions could actually work for those sectors. So it was basically more a process support that we gave, where we basically matched innovators with SMEs, corporate sector, government, and did a number of rounds where we identified the innovators and moderated some co-creation sessions. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. And those sessions actually, created sometimes good matches and they ran off with it. Sometimes it took more time to really kind of engage them and help them to collaborate. The third level was, if we can call it, is this already the new normal? But let's call it like that, was like, hey, what we've seen throughout the past 6 months is that actually a lot of specifically digital innovations could be leveraged and to adapt and adjust to the new normal. So a lot of actually companies realized that this might help them. And so we thought, like, how can we leverage innovations to support others to actually adapt and adjust to that new normal? What is that new normal? And how can we make an ongoing process of innovations can actually help your businesses to thrive. It can actually help to push certain sector performance, and it can actually help government to fulfill their development plans. And so what we did then in that third level, let's say, of support, was introducing innovators to corporates, development partners, governments, having a number of what we call the kind of corporate breakfast sessions where we would allow innovators to pitch to certain groups of people, of institutes in Tanzania, but also illustrate how these innovations have been accelerated during COVID-19. And discuss, like, how can we further leverage that and how can we support partnerships, because it's not like a one-off, you know. How can we further actually make use of those innovations that are present in Tanzania? Yeah, please can go to the next slide. I think this is my final slide. Yeah, so summarizing, as I mentioned in the beginning, we learned a lot of lessons, but we also saw that actually the COVID-19 period forced us also to look into resilience, recovery, creating actually, solid sectors and using innovations for that. So it was actually an opportunity for innovators in Tanzania to prove their value, and they've been seen as such. It also accelerated and stimulated the transition that we found very necessary to move to a more demand-driven innovation process. Because, as you know, donor agencies, they are needed to maybe bridge a certain gap, but sometimes they also distort market processes. And it should be, what we found very important is that innovators react to a certain demand rather than to a certain opportunity only. So that we saw was actually accelerated. And it accelerated the uptake of innovations, which was great to see. What we also saw and what we try to stimulate more is like public-private partnerships between SMEs, government, innovators. I think that is slowly also materializing, but that's a slow process. So therefore we also feel, and we are now working on kind of informing different donors, like what should be your next step, how can you use this momentum and strategically finance actually innovators to go to the next level, is that we feel that there should be a much more integrated and aligned approach to innovation, where donors actually unlock private sector finance. That's, I think, your discussion for tomorrow. And where they also address like what steps do we need to take to really scale and uptake innovations, and how can we do that together, and how can we align our efforts much more with private sector, but also how can we further strengthen the innovation ecosystem in Tanzania to kind of continuously support innovators and to allow them to work to that next towards that next level. So yeah, let me end here. I hope I didn't talk too long, but yeah.
No, that was great. Thank you so much for speaking.
You're welcome.
I was scribbling away whilst you were talking. It was so interesting. There were so many parallels actually between sort of the challenges that you flagged in innovation ecosystems, and also the summary points and the sort of rapid analysis work that we have done over the past few months, and sort of concluding with the fact that partnerships are so key. So that was an interesting presentation. Thank you so much. So we will now be moving on to Victor Cond, who will be speaking to us today. He is the Scientific Affairs Officer with the UN Economic Commission for Africa. He holds a PhD in biochemistry and is a postdoc alumnus of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He's also a Fellow of the World Academy of Arts and Science, a member of the International Advisory Panel of the Combat Diseases of Poverty Consortium, and the founder of the African Technology Development Forum. He has over 20 years of postgraduate work experience in the private and public sectors. So Victor, over to you. We're delighted to have you with us here today.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I do not have much of slides, but I have talking points. I'm not so sure you want them. Otherwise, I could share them.
No problem. Feel free to just talk away.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation. And of course, thank you very much for participating in our last meeting, I think sometime in June. So I'll be perhaps more looking at, I think the question that you pose is, how do we ensure innovation funding attains the desired impact, and especially for the target beneficiaries? Maybe to just provide an overview, I will be looking at from a little bit of what ECA does, just to make sure that everyone knows what ECA is. And ECA is one of the regional economic commissions of the United Nations. So there's one for Europe, which is ECE, based in Geneva. There's the ECLAC, I think, for Latin America and the Caribbean, in Chile. And then there's ESCAP, which is in Bangkok, and there's ESCWA, which is in Lebanon, and then there is ECA, which is in Africa. So they are basically just arms of the United Nations, whose main focus is to promote economic and social development of their regions. In terms of what we have done, perhaps I'll start from what we have done before we go to what we should be doing. I think, like I said in the beginning, I think KTN did have actually an entire roundtable when we organized the Innovation and Investment Forum for COVID-19 2020 in June. And we brought quite a number of people, and the forum basically was intended to bring the people that fund innovations together with the people that have innovations. So we had, I think, over 200 people that applied, and from it, I think we got a short list of somewhere around, I think, 8. They came from about 38 countries, and we had about 29 pitches, and we had 4 showcasings. So in a way, there is quite a lot of innovation taking place within the continent, and that perhaps was one of the main lessons that came out of, I think, where we can draw from COVID-19 and the work that we have done. And we also organized the COVID-19 Innovation Competition and Design Bootcamp, which took place over a period of 2 weeks, and we had over 264 young people from universities that applied, but focused on the youth, and we had about 105 mentors, 10 groups. And so in a way, the main aim was, how can they learn new techniques and new knowledge, and how do they prepare the next generation of innovators and entrepreneurs actually to be market ready. And they looked at, I think, different areas like medical devices and PPEs, contact tracing and isolation, new testing approaches, and then medical devices for therapy. So in a way, again, one of the things perhaps we have learned is we had a number of young people from Europe, from the US, from Asia, including countries like Singapore, and then of course from a majority of them from Africa. And it was nice to just see how many are actually working on different things on their own even before that, and to see what their suggestions are. And so most of my other presentation perhaps will really talk about some of the lessons we are drawing from it. But as you see also, and like I said, we're an economic commission, so we also done a lot of work around economics of COVID-19, what its impact is. And so we help in calculating how much COVID-19 is going to cost a lot of sectors. And also most of that work has been carried by the media. And we also been supporting countries and the African unions to negotiate the deferment of payments of the money they borrowed some time back. So it's not about stopping paying, it's just about can we pay next year and give us a breathing space for the next 2 years. As you know, most African countries are not like the US, they can't just print money. Or like the UK, they can decide to print money. But if Zambia decided to print money, perhaps the economy disappears. So in a way, those are issues we've been raising, I think, this year with a lot of the developed countries. And some of it has already started yielding, I think, outcomes where we've seen a number of countries saying they are willing to maybe just postpone the payment for public debt. And there's also still negotiation around private debt, since we're talking about funding. And of course, we have also the platforms for using digital, which is like pool procurement. Most African countries are paying different prices for exactly the same thing. So we build a platform where they can have actual access exactly the same product for exactly the same amount for pharmaceuticals. And that is already actually being used by a number of countries ranging from Ghana. So in a way, that is something we've been supporting, and also in sharing information and also in lobbying for more support for the continent. Perhaps for the discussion we are having, the question we are talking about is multilateral funding for innovation. And the question is what do we really mean by multilateral, and what do we really mean by innovation, and who are the innovators? And I think if we have kind of a shared understanding, it's very easy for us perhaps to agree on where we go in some areas and free to disagree in areas where we don't want to. So on one hand, are we talking about the World Bank, IMF, and the African Development Bank or their equivalent? Or are we talking about DFID, SIDA, and their equivalents? Or are we talking about regional arrangements, for instance? Or are we talking about foundations? So in a way, I think there are there's perhaps some support from a number of institutions working together for the likes of DFID, SIDA Canada, SIDA Sweden, and for example, maybe South African National Innovation, National Research Fund, and they can easily work together. Or we are hoping that the likes of World Bank and the African Development Bank, perhaps the IMFs and others can actually also team up and work together in promoting innovation. The foundations, I think, already kind of collaborate across with a lot of our traditional funders. Now, what we mean by innovation, that also is a different question I think perhaps we need to answer. Are we talking about research? Are we talking about development, production, marketing, distribution, the entire innovation value chain? Or what is it actually that we wish to see supported when we talk about innovation? And finally, are we talking about academia? Are we talking about industry? Are we talking about individuals? We're talking about informal firms. And the reason I raise it is because you have a lot of informal and I think everyone has been calling frugal innovations around COVID-19. The thing that you pedal and then wash your hands without touching a tap or something like that. Most of those innovations are pretty difficult for formal institutions, for example, to support because they're actually by individuals, and the individuals be supported by multilateral funding institutions or bilateral funding institutions. And of course, there's also the informality of the individual or the informality of the firm. In some cases, the informality of the innovation itself. And so those themselves also present significant challenge. At least one of the things we've learned in trying to support, especially youth and individuals, is always you can't tell which one is actually informal. Is it the person, the firm, or is it the innovation they're actually working on? And of course, the many innovations around COVID have been by individuals and micro firms, and almost a few of them, for the ones that we worked with, got any support from their governments. So in a way, almost none actually really was supported by many of the multilateral funding arrangements. So perhaps there is some space for us to see, well, how do we actually share the discussions so that we can get the multilateral funding institutions, not just to partner, but also to focus on some of the small and micro firms that employ most of the people, especially in Africa. There are a couple of examples, of course, of things that already work. We've seen the South Africa and Finland working together on BioFISA, and we're supporting SunBio for the entire SADC region. But that funding was actually a bilateral arrangement between South African government and Finland. It wasn't really a SADC funding arrangement. And so those present an example where you can get two countries to work together. And of course, there are a lot of the likes of alliances for accelerating excellence in science in Africa, by the African Academy of Sciences or NEPAD. So in a way, those are brought together a lot of donors, but I have looked at it again and again. So we find ourselves like ECA and maybe Wellcome Trust and maybe DFID and others funding those kind of arrangements. There we have very few of the likes of World Bank, IMF, or African Development Bank, or even the regional banks like PTA Bank actually funding the innovation through this kind of those arrangements. And then, of course, there's the type of the EU-Africa, which is between the EU and the African Union. And that has been going on for many years, but that's a bilateral arrangement that is basically between two regional blocks. Just one happens to be Africa and the other one happens to be the European Union. And they're also providing funding now, whether we should call it funding for innovation or funding for research, because really the focus is on research. So in a way, those are some of the, I think, when we look at the complete innovation value chain, whether we're talking about, we're looking at basic and applied research, experimental development, testing, trials, and piloting, and production, marketing, supply, and distribution. I think when we look at funding, most of the funding is really concentrated in the basic and applied research, and then it really thins out as we go towards the end. There is a feeling most of the traditional funding institutions or even multilateral funding arrangements, they are more happy to find the bigger scale than on the extreme end, and also the research and development. So most of the, for example, the World Bank Centers of Excellence around Africa are almost all focusing on research. So the question is, who is funding the testing, the trials, the piloting? Who is funding the production and marketing? But what's the point of funding research if we are not going to actually move it forward? And so that is why perhaps there is a little disconnect. And of course, in our ecosystem, there are a lot of innovation hubs. That's great. But most of those innovation hubs themselves are disconnected from the research and development. In a way, they are, even when they start the university, they are basically, they could have been outside the university. So we may also, perhaps they may need the lack of institutional support so they can actually tap into partners that work with their universities in terms of getting funding, especially from bilateral institutions. And perhaps the other issue is when looking at institutions, let's take just the African Development Bank. They fund countries. And if they are funding a country, it takes almost like 10 years of negotiations. And so either we already negotiate in advance to get innovation funded, but we have things like COVID showing up there, or we have innovation that will take to market. They don't have too much time to wait of when those institutions either decide to have a meeting, when their board makes a decision, because by which time it's really pretty much too late. So we need to further kind of encourage different, I think, funding arrangements. And for that, I think I'll now be concluding by just looking at what I think, or what we have been noticing as some of the missing links perhaps we need to focus on. I think there is almost limited funding for individuals and most of our micro firms. And so most of them literally have, we did a survey here in Zambia where I am now because of COVID-19, I'm working from home. But we found they may even have gotten money from the private sector and their micro firms, but they could not get money from their own governments. And of course, absolutely not from any of the multilateral funding arrangements, not even if they work in isolation or in partnership. So those are perhaps some issues that we wish to to figure out how do we actually encourage them to fund individuals, where most of the innovation around COVID have come from. The second aspect is what we learned, especially from most of the support we provided to young people at universities and research institutions. And also in working with the organization like SunBio and BioInnovate, which we served on a number of their committees. And their funding mechanism, sure, but most of them are really funding small amounts. Anything, there are plenty of them around 5,000, 10,000, that's okay. But a lot of, so if we really want to achieve scale, we need to have funding in excess of 100,000 and above. Really, we should be looking at 1 million and over. And everyone is getting stuck in this pool of people, each one with their own little innovation stack, because they can't actually work with anybody else, because they actually don't have any money. So you have money for big ventures, which is where all the money, I think, from the International Finance Corporation, for example, goes. And then you have money for the little things, which is what is coming, I think, from most of our traditional donors, giving you 5,000, 10,000 for winning an award. So what do you do with it exactly? And so perhaps we need to have something in the middle there that we need to create a pool, because even the equity funds that we have around Africa, a number of them can't fund any in excess of $100,000. And of course, most of the funding is also on research. So there are a lot of funding for research. There is almost really no funding for innovation, and almost little goes into production. If you say we are now about to start producing it and marketing it, no one wants to give you money because they think you're going to make money. You're almost already rich. We're in a continent where people live on $2, so you are almost already a rich guy. I think we need to figure out on how we can convince everyone that if we're going to create more jobs and wealth, perhaps we have to support everybody across in our innovation system. There must be anchor firms, and those are the firms that we need to grow to become anchors. They themselves will need support. And of course, the goals and evaluation systems, there's a complete mismatch. We fund research, but we want to find out if people's lives were changed. We don't change people's lives. We have to put the product on the market. We have to put it on the table. So how do you jump from funding research and going to, so there is actually perhaps the goals, how we set our goals, and then how we set our evaluation system is something we need to encourage, perhaps, besides just whether they are partnering. And finally, of course, who define the goals and objectives? I think funding institutions defining the goals and institution on their own is really doesn't work. I mean, it's like a bank defining what kind of business, how businesses should be run in order for you to get support. I think it will not work because people actually design different businesses. I mean, even the restaurants come in different forms and they use different models. Then people can come and say, okay, this is what I'm looking at. Perhaps we can define a sector. But I think when we define the funding so detailed, most of the innovation or innovators or entrepreneurs simply cannot fit into this nicely well set up jacket of goals and objectives and rules that we put in. And perhaps we need to find out how do we provide funding arrangements that provide sufficient room for people to, for innovators actually to bring their products to market. Or successfully grow their businesses. So in a way, those are some of the few things I was thinking about. So I'll stop here, and I have a few notes and I'll share them with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Some really valuable insights, interesting examples there. And thanks also for flagging the challenges specifically around perhaps the size of different funding pots and also the need to streamline different processes. It's all really interesting to hear. I am conscious of time. We are now moving on to a sort of roundtable Q&A discussion. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Charlotte Thompson, who's the Knowledge Transfer Manager for Digital Economy at KTN, but until recently she was working in access to funding and finance, and she will be leading with the questions today. So thank you so much, Charlotte.
Thank you, Sean. I've made so many notes as well. It was I really enjoyed these presentations, so thank you very much. I just wanted to kick off by talking about actually those proposed perhaps new funding mechanisms. How can they adapt and be agile to these very changing circumstances and to get that funding directly to the people that really need it, who are developing these innovative companies? And I wonder, Lalit, whether you would like to start first by addressing that question.
Sure, Charlotte. I mean, so I will say that GIF is one such mechanism. 6-7 years back when GIF was started, actually it was, and it continues to be supported by USAID, DFID back then, and some of the other large multilateral agencies, bilateral agencies. So I think it is widely acknowledged that some of the large agencies, for various reasons, one of them just being processes, are unable to support innovations which are agile, which are not as proven. Like Victor talked in detail about all the variety of challenges that they face. So I think there is definitely need for funding either mechanisms or agencies which can process such smaller organizations, more innovative, nimble, but who do not necessarily have the track record or can write proposals, let's say, of the nature that is sort of acceptable. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Victor. You provided a really good overview of the challenges of the lack of funding, where the funding is perhaps in more research organisations. And we actually had a question that came through from the audience from Eddie Bakika, who is actually, you talked about young innovators and actually understanding the local context and finding new solutions, especially in light of COVID. But what support is available for perhaps those that are not in the formal institutions? I don't know, Victor, whether is there any funding available?
There is funding available. I think there's no doubt that there is funding available. Actually, most of the surveys by World Bank for business find a lot of funding. That most of our countries actually among the top ones that say, well, business, we call the survey businesses, and businesses say, well, finding funding in Kenya or in Zambia is not a problem. So there is one side where is the mature businesses can easily get funding because they have the networks and have everything else. So one of the things we've been thinking about is there are two ways. One, we can either focus to set up new kind of funding vehicles that can support, for example, young people, and that's something discussion going on right now. The second one is, can we create the kind of like special spaces that actually do research and only research and to take products to basically to provide solutions. And so we have actually a discussion going on now to trying to establish, can we, for example, set up special, I think, research vehicles like in the 4 regions of Africa that permanently are dedicated to finding solutions for the continent and are free to fail and are free to experiment with things that are coming out. Because there's this idea that the thing that needs to be funded must be tested and must be, you must prove that it's working. But that means you're working on something for 10 years ago. That's the only thing you can prove for that's working. How about if you're working on things that will be working in the next 20 years? And for those, we really need kind of a special vehicle to encourage that kind of research, that kind of innovation. You know, there were things like the MIT Media Lab. They were showing off something that looked like Facebook 20 years before Facebook. So the question is, how do we get Africa to that level? So that is something we're actually having a discussion, and we'll possibly be launching something soon to try and see if there's any people that can take it and provide some funding that will have like special labs that just people can do research and they're free to dream the way they want to dream, and let them fail, let them succeed, that's okay. So that's one. Then of course, we need to perhaps work also with our banks. We saw, for example, here that we got the African Development Bank, the Economic Empowerment Fund, and others. The fund that put together about $50 million, and only to fund, for example, innovation around fish. So why are we not doing the same for kind of the most important things, like we're talking about like healthcare? There's almost no one doing that for healthcare. They can do it for fish, they can do it for cassava. So why not for healthcare? Or why not, for example, for communication? I mean, our internet keeps dropping. If such as someone calls me on my phone right now, I'll drop off because I'm connected through my phone. On the other hand, I actually have a whole box that was supposed to be using, but the guy was upgrading the network today and I'm out. So in a way, we really need to figure out on how do we get funding in those areas like energy, where we have blackouts the whole day. Why are we not asking funding for innovations in those really key sectors that can drive economies, key for healthcare, they will be key for development. And for me, those are like really missing gaps. Okay to say we'll be putting solar panels, but why are we not funding people to come out with different models and make their own solar panels or make their own solar cells?
Brilliant. And Marilyn, I'd welcome your view on how funders can get the funding to those that really need it.
Yes, I was eager to respond to that. Because I do see that there is a tendency, and we also saw that in Tanzania, that on one hand, it's very difficult actually for funders to find the innovators, because you need a mechanism, actually, a marketplace where you can actually find those innovators. So we had lengthy discussions around that. And what you see is that you tend to finance the usual suspects who are really good in talking the donor language and who've proven their case, you know. So you're talking about the bigger innovators, actually, if it comes to private sector and startups, the small ones that we are talking about. So so we've been discussing that a lot over the last years, actually, and HDF is working closely with the Tanzanian Commission for Science and Technology, which is basically an advisory organ for the government around innovation, tech, and science. And COSTECH has been very much driving that agenda, like how can we find, as we call it, the grassroots innovators. And so COSTECH has established their own hub, BUNI, it's called BUNI, that is now primarily working with university hubs or university hubs, potential university hubs, and intends to actually support those hubs in finding those innovators, like the young graduates who have never come across any donor, but who are actually quite keen to have their innovation being further developed and scaled, and have sufficient support. And a lot of the hubs that are out there right now are providing support and are actually identifying startups. But to go a level down, it requires actually a very intentional intervention, and to really identify those young startups, those young grassroots innovations, and enable them to grow. So at the moment, we are kind of making this mapping, because we are kind of now looking at what should happen, like who is actually where, and how can we actually identify those startups that have nowhere to go, but also how can we link them to trustworthy institutes that could channel finance, you know, to them, because that's the other thing. A donor will never go directly to grassroots innovators, so you have to create kind of a whole structure through which this finance can be channeled. So that is kind of work in progress, but it's indeed something to give attention to. Yeah,
I think that's what I found fascinating about your presentation earlier. It's about you not necessarily just focusing about funding innovative companies, but actually funding aspects of the innovation ecosystem.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
But how on earth do you prioritize that when there are so many actors involved?
Yeah, it's a good point. Well, it's not, we are not the only ones.
Yeah.
And I think what we also have been doing is informing a lot of donors that want to move into this innovation space, and well, give them a bit voice over when you look at the whole innovation ecosystem, like, hey, where is attention needed? And yeah, we're just at the beginning. It's very nascent still, the innovation ecosystem here, but it's actually picking up the pace quite fast. And of course, there are some key strategic players, there are smaller players, but yeah, it's building up. And yeah, you can't do it all. You basically, you know, construct a house, a village, I would say, to really support the innovators. Yeah.
We've had a follow-up question from Eddie Bakika about actually the need to have responded recently as a result of COVID the need has been so fast. And I know, Lalit, that you talked about actually supporting your existing portfolio with additional funding. So what are the turnaround times that you were having to achieve to meet those needs?
That's for me, this question?
I directed it at Lalit, but I would welcome your input as well.
Yeah, so for our portfolio firms, the turnaround time is fairly short. We can turn around in as little as 3 weeks, and that's, we already know those firms. We closely collaborate with them anyway on an ongoing basis. So yeah, so the turnaround time there is fairly short, but yeah, if a new innovator is coming in, then the turnaround time is longer. It's between 3 months to 4 months, 5 months, even depending on how complex the innovation is and the geography and the organization.
Just still, I always think it's usually about 6 months to raise funding. So still 3 to 4 months on a new business to do all of that due diligence work is still very, very good. Although the need is probably more pressing.
Yeah, and I would also highlight that, as I said, I think we have made investments where we have had to trust the innovator. And yeah, I mean, in normal times, we would do much more rigorous diligence, but we have cut down on the process and also cut down on how deep we go. So that's a trade-off we had to make.
And Marilyn, from your portfolio for existing innovative companies, but also new companies you are being introduced to?
Yeah, so our existing ones was, well, obviously pretty easy because we didn't have to go through due diligence processes and all of that. So that went quite fast. What we also did in addition, and I didn't talk about that during the presentation, is that we did, as also Victor was mentioning, some call for proposals, some challenge events where we actually invited new companies to come in. But we always worked with innovation hubs to do so. So in order to create a shorter kind of time to really process the proposals and to also do the proper due diligence, we worked actually with innovation hubs to do a lot of that work also, because they already knew some of the companies. And we are having another challenge coming up soon, where we again will ask innovation hubs to organize that challenge for us, so that we can skip a number of stages that you would do if you would work with a complete unknown company. So there's some work that they could do for us, because at the end I think there are always hubs that know a number of companies that are aware of their work, and so that's the way in which we try to keep some agility in the process.
I want to pick up on a theme that I saw in all of your presentations about evidencing impact and being able to quantify and evaluate not necessarily just the economic returns, but also the social and sustainable impact. And Victor, you were saying about, this can't just be about through research organisation and evaluation systems, but actually how does this change lives? And have you seen any good practices of where good evaluation systems have been implemented?
Well, thank you. Well, yes, but I think, there are a couple of good practices by a number of institutions that often they either get someone private to do their evaluation. And alternative, and then of course there is perhaps at a broader level is we often do, like, we make a plan, then where we do implementation, and then we are done. Then we now ask the question, okay, let's evaluate. I think actually you should have your monitoring and evaluation from day one, so that when you're actually implementing, you are tracking how you get to that particular goal. So as long as our funding institutions, especially the public ones, and also maybe start to think a little bit more like what is it that they actually want to get out, and what will be the measure of success. when they are done, then they really don't need a sophisticated evaluation tool. They can literally track progress as they move ahead. Now, after that, of course, they are free to hire the most sophisticated business firm to do it. I mean, we just finished doing one, I think, for one of the institutions in South Africa. So that's okay. But they'll come in with their tools and tell you, in many cases, you can tell them what you want them to find out, and they can go and find it out for you. Until you have an independent research institution, I mean, recently we had DAGRA, for example, by Tufts University, produced an entire report on them, and now they're arguing on whether that research was right to conclude that they missed their targets. But the question we're asking is, if they had those targets themselves and they were actually following them, instead of following how many people they funded, which product they were funding, and which government they are working with, and producing only nice pictures of the farms and everything else, they would have known if they are off track or they are on track. So we are actually trying to do that even within ECA, where we're asking the same question. We also need to change how we track progress. And I'm thinking that perhaps is really something we all need to think about seriously. How do we actually track progress every day, not when we are finished? The project is done, and then we are wondering, okay, did we do it? Well, if you didn't look for where you're going, I think you have missed the road. So in a way, that is something for me, the bigger question we should be asking: how do we ensure that we have the right targets from the beginning, and we can perhaps monitor them, and where will the evidence come from? Because there's no point in having targets if you don't know how you're going to collect the data or where the evidence will be coming from.
And Charlotte, if I may add, I mean, in the same vein, in the same vein of what Victor is saying, I think what we have done at GIF quite a bit in the last couple of years is process indicators. So we can either ask for evaluations, expensive evaluations at end of the project, but then in some ways we miss the boat, at least with that investment. So upfront, why not think about process indicators, which are not expensive and which is something, as Victor was saying, something we should be measuring. And if we have the right process indicators, then we will have a broad sense of if we are doing everything that needs to be done well. And then, yes, there is definitely value of evaluations, but then each project doesn't need to be evaluated as rigorously. So that is something that we have tried to use as a tool, and something that we think is a good proxy measure of are things working or not.
Yeah, maybe I can also add to that.
Yeah.
I can only echo Lalit in that, but I would also like to add that in innovation programs, you should also consider failure as an output. And that is something that donors are not used to. So innovation fails, and that is a learning, and that actually leads to an improved, version of that innovation. So you should fail in an innovation program, and that is definitely an output. And so that's one thing that I would like to add to this. The other thing is that log frames and innovation, they sound almost like a contradiction. So it's important to pivot a lot, including your log frame. So, and we found that in our case, FCDO has been very, very open to do that. If you are looking in a very rigid way to an innovation program and try to squeeze it in a log frame, that is very difficult. So you need to be open to also pivot your log frame and pivot your theory of change almost, and have a continuous discussion based on what Victor also said rightly, a continuous learning to pivot actually your log frame again and again, and to pivot your strategy consequently again and again. That is very important. So that would be my two additions. Yeah.
Trying to think whether, is that a cultural thing from a donor's perspective? Is that not enough evidence yet to demonstrate where, yes, innovation is risky, but through a diverse portfolio, you can get great returns? Is sort of just trying to unpick that kind of actually, we say that failure is a necessary requirement of innovation, yet how do we embrace that? If we can come back to you, Marilyn, again, to put you on the spot.
Well, So an innovation process is a kind of continuous process of it says itself. Yeah, like you have an idea, you roll it out, you prototype it, you test it, you improve it. And it might be that the track that one of the innovators that you chose to support was not the right track. So you need to move a bit to the right. So his failure actually enabled me and him again to actually choose another direction. And normally, if you have a program and you have a certain number of outputs, you just tick the box. Okay, today I do that, and then I plan to work with 40 women groups, and the 40 women groups lead to an empowered structure of blah, blah, blah. In innovation, you sometimes don't know. So there is an intention and there is an ambition to have a certain, to score a certain impact and to have a solution for that. But you also need to prototype the solution and improve the solution. And what we see very often also in innovations is that you really need to design for scale from the very beginning. So we saw a lot of, well, failing is a wrong word in this context, but a lot of, let's say, weaker innovations because they never included all the actors that could support this innovator to scale, and including the final consumer. So if you don't design with your final user, you have already an issue. So if you kind of pick up that, you know, like, hey, I made a beautiful digital solution, and at the end, nobody can use it because it's too difficult, or it's not affordable, or it's not accessible for all kinds of reasons, you need to pivot that. And we noticed that that was really difficult for a lot of innovators. So we kind of brought that in. So you might want to design with the end user. You might want to design with actually the CBOs, the CSOs and government in this area to make sure that they understand it and they can also support at the end your scaling potential. So yeah, so then they picked that up, started again, and you know, so in that sense, I say this is not failing. This is progressive learning.
You're living and breathing it. It's brilliant, and it's interesting. It picked up on some of the things that Victor, you were talking about working with young innovators on local challenges, and making sure that kind of that strong need and solution. So, how do you work with ensuring that there's that kind of fail fast, innovative, an ability to pivot with these young people?
Well, okay, the good thing with young people is they are more, what do you call it? They can take a few more risks, because it's not like their careers are fire kind of cast in stone, like when you are old. You really don't want to change anything, kind of like your life the way it is. So in a way, that's perhaps a positive part. So in a way, you could work with them over different things. And one of the biggest challenge when we started working with young people is they can come today and tell you they now have a product around bananas. Say, okay, go and think about this. And then come back tomorrow, they have another one around groundnuts. Like, okay, so which one is the real product you want to look at? The next time they show up, they're okay, now they have something around health. Now they have an app. So we try to figure to sort out, like, can you find which of the things actually fit you as a person? Because it is actually you who is the business. You know, no one actually finds an idea. We find people. So we need to trust the person that they actually know what they're talking about. We need to trust them that they mean what they're. So most of it was about building that so that they become actually ready to, when they go to meet people in their funding situations, or they're looking for partners, that these people can actually, in a way, kind of trust them. The second bigger problem we feel perhaps around young people, before we say all the nice things, is always they want to do everything around this innovation. It's like, I want to make a car, and then they'll make a tire, they'll make the lights, they'll make the what. Like, you know, there's actually a whole company that just makes tires and they don't do anything else. Yeah, but they want to make my own tires. And they're trying to make them to focus on what is this thing around the car that you are so good at. And therefore, you can actually make a significant business around it. And that is a problem, I think. Well, now, it's a good thing that they're dreaming about everything, but it would be great if they can actually focus their effort on the thing they are perhaps really good at or they're passionate about. And so we spend a bit of time with young people, basically just working around that. And I think one of the things my colleague said is all these serial award winners, we try to avoid them. If a person tells me they have won this award, won that award, and they have not, they haven't moved, so we're like, okay, what's the point? You're still young, you ordered 20 awards, and you haven't made progress, then what's the point? So in a way, it's been quite easy in building up their capacity, matching them with mentors. That's been one of perhaps the best one. UK we match people who are only like 5,000 with a mentor who can help them get to a bank and to help them get solutions. So in a way, you can easily build up those important skills that they actually lack, the networks that they can penetrate what people already have, but they don't have. So they can work with someone actually who is not really an entrepreneur, but knows almost everybody. So if you have this one person, you can send him any kid you have with a great idea and they can work with them. So over time, that is something, we started with funding actually when we were here in Lusaka. We got $500,000 and we still had the idea. We thought was there are a lot of things ready to go to market by young people. And we, I think, spent like $200,000 and we concluded, no, it's not working. Maybe we should try and see, can we actually help them to come up with really decent business ideas? And then around it, and stopping them, like, stop dreaming, can we just focus a little bit? And now we begin to see some of the ones that are now successful. And so that's great. And so for most of the support has been really about building up those skill sets that in young people, but otherwise there are a lot of young people that are very dynamic with hundreds of ideas. We're sure the failing is okay, but they should fail because they tried their best and failed. Not they failed because they were not really trying. So in a way, I think we try to separate those two apart. And it helps us to work with young people. And we run our Innovators Summer School every year. And that way we create a club for them. So the kids that came, I think, to our first Innovators Summer School in 2012 are still talking to each other even today in their Facebook groups. And they've gone on to now made a friend. So in a way, though you create a whole huge network across the continent, people come from different countries. So, and that has been perhaps something very interesting to see grow around the youth.
Yeah, unfortunately running out of time. So I just want to finish with one question to you all. And I'd like one sentence on what your recommendation, your call to action would be for how can multilateral funding help address African innovation? So what do you want to see? One thing, if I can. And Elite, do you want to kick us off as we conclude?
Yeah, I think we have talked about it. I would say vehicles which are much less onerous than the normal processes.
Great, thank you. And Marilyn?
Yeah, I think I touched upon it. Use your finance to actually unlock other finances and to build the capacity of the ecosystem.
And Victor?
I think if they can deepen some of the existing funding mechanisms that are already in a way successful, that would be great.
Brilliant. Thank you very much to our panel. I'm going to hand back to Sian to talk about next steps and also what to expect in our other sessions of the series. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was really interesting. And thank you again to all of our panelists. So we would really like to invite those of you that are watching on YouTube and of course our panelists as well to join further sessions over the next 2 weeks. So links can be found in the chat box if you are watching on YouTube. In particular, we'd like to invite you to join our Global Ideas Exchange Summit, which is taking place on Thursday, the 29th of October. And that will be a bit of a summary of all of the activities that we will have held over the three weeks prior to that. I should also mention that we have a networking platform called Meeting Mojo, which you can use. So the link will be in your registration email. Thank you so much to everybody for joining. A massive thanks to our panel. I think you'll all agree it was an absolutely incredible group of speakers today. Thank you again to Charlotte for moderating. And we do hope that we'll see you all soon. Thank you.